22 million cubic feet of earth. That is how much dirt went into a single mound in southern Illinois, a flat-topped pyramid that still stands taller than a 10-story building. And they built it without the wheel, without draft animals, and without a single metal tool. Every basket of that earth, and there were something like 15 million baskets, was dug by hand and carried up on a human back, one load at a time. And that was one mound. Across the eastern half of what is now the United States, people built tens of thousands of them. Most are gone now, flattened by the plow, long before anyone thought to study what was inside. But in the 1800s, as farmers cut the biggest ones open and newspapers rushed to print what came out, two things kept turning up in the accounts: sheets of worked copper, hammered into blades and breastplates, and bones that the papers swore were far too large to belong to ordinary men. The copper was real. It sits in museums today. What almost nobody remembers now is that the copper and the bones were tangled together in those reports from the very start, and pulling them apart would take the Smithsonian more than 100 years. If you had asked a settler pushing west through the Ohio Valley in 1820 who built these earthworks, they would have answered with total confidence. Not the Native Americans. Anyone but them. Surely some vanished race, a lost people, older and wiser, had raised these monuments and then disappeared. That belief was everywhere, and it was completely wrong. But hold on to it, because it quietly explains almost everything that happened next. The people who actually built the mounds had been here the whole time. Archaeologists group them into cultures that rose and fell over thousands of years. The Adena, the Hopewell, who ran trade routes so vast they pulled copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and shark teeth from the Gulf Coast into the same burial chambers. And then the Mississippians, whose largest city we now call Cahokia. Cahokia is the part that stops people. Around the year 1100, on the floodplain across the river from modern St. Louis, it held somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. That made it bigger than London at the same moment in history. It would remain the largest city anywhere in what is now the United States until Philadelphia finally passed it in the 1700s. 6 square miles of houses, plazas, and around 120 mounds laid out on a plan aligned to the movement of the sun. At the center stood the mound we started with, 100 feet tall, 14 acres at the base, roughly the same footprint as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Built basket by basket, by hand, by a people the newcomers flatly refused to believe were capable of it. The monuments were so impressive that the story invented to explain them was that the locals could not possibly have done it. That is the stereotype this whole video is going to take apart. So let's start with the part that is not in dispute. The copper. The mound builders were metal workers, though not in the way we usually mean the word. They did not smelt ore or pour molten metal. They worked native copper, chunks of the pure stuff that occur naturally around Lake Superior, hammering it cold, heating it in a fire to soften it, then hammering again until it became sheets thin enough to cut and shape. The Hopewell beat it into breastplates worn across the chest, into ear ornaments, and into flat, cut-out silhouettes of falcons and human hands. Centuries later, the Mississippians raised it into something even more striking. Plates. The most famous of these came out of a mound at the Etowah site in northern Georgia, dug up in the 1880s by a man named John Rogan. On beaten copper, someone had raised the image of a winged figure, part human and part falcon, in profile, in motion, wearing the same ornaments the living elite wore. Similar plates have surfaced across the southeast and Midwest, from Spiro in Oklahoma to a cache of 8 that a farmer named Ray Grooms turned up while plowing a field in Missouri in 1906. Most of them appear to have been made in one place, Cahokia, and then carried hundreds of miles along trade routes to the people important enough to be buried with them. This was a continent-spanning copper economy, centuries before Columbus set sail. Now here is where the copper and the bones cross paths. when the Smithsonian's own investigators cut into a mound at South Charleston in West Virginia, they found a burial 24 feet below the summit. A single body, laid out in a log tomb, resting on sheets of copper, surrounded by 10 others. Copper and a prominent burial, together, exactly the way the newspapers had been describing for decades. So the papers were not making up the copper. The question is what else they were describing. Because alongside the copper, again and again, the reports fixed on size. A skeleton of enormous stature, 7 feet, 8 feet. In the wildest accounts, and there were plenty of wild accounts, 12, 15, even 20 feet, which is not a tall man but a physical impossibility. Some were said to be wearing copper, as if armored. When crews opened the great mounds of West Virginia, the tallest cones of earth in the whole country, more than one dig produced a report of a body of unusual length among the burials, with a jaw that could slip over a living man's face. These stories were not rare. From the 1840s into the early 1900s, they ran in papers all across the country, hundreds of them, usually written up by the local doctor or the minister or the farmer who had done the digging. And that detail matters more than it looks, because it tells you exactly who was holding the measuring tape. That was the story the public knew. A race of giants buried in copper, quietly vanishing into government crates. Behind the scenes, the reality was both less dramatic and, in its own way, stranger. Consider what a 7-foot skeleton actually is. It is remarkable, but it is not fiction. 7-footers walk around today. A powerful chief, unusually tall in life, buried with honor in the largest tomb his people could raise on a bed of copper, is a completely believable thing to pull out of a mound. That is not a typo and it is not a hoax. That is just a big man. The trouble starts when you move up the scale and the numbers stop making sense the longer you stare at them. 9 feet strains it. 12 feet breaks it. And 20 feet is not a person at all. So somewhere between the honest grave of a tall chief and the impossible measurement of a giant, something was going wrong. To figure out what, you have to follow the bones. Where did they go? A few were photographed badly. Some were shown off at county fairs and then lost. Others, the reports say, were crated up and shipped east to the one institution collecting mound material on a national scale, the Smithsonian. For over a century, that has had two very different answers, and they lead to opposite places. The first is the one you have probably heard. The bones went to the Smithsonian and were never seen again. No giant skeleton is on display there. No catalogue lists one. To a certain way of thinking, that absence is not a gap in the record. It is the fingerprint of a cover-up. The claim goes that the institution made these remains disappear on purpose because giants did not fit the official story of the human past. And this theory did not stay trapped in dusty newspapers. It has a modern engine. In 2014, a website ran a story announcing that the Smithsonian had finally admitted, under a Supreme Court order, to destroying thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s to protect the accepted timeline of evolution. It spread everywhere. Millions of people saw it. There is just one problem. That website publishes satire and says so in its own disclaimer. There was no Supreme Court order. There was no admission. The most shared proof of the cover-up is a piece of fiction that went viral because people wanted it to be true. Even the famous photo of the giant thigh bone that travels with it is a sculpture, made by a museum artist from a written description and labeled as a sculpture by the man who carved it. So if the strongest evidence is invented, is there nothing here at all? Not quite, because the real story of who dug up these mounds is stranger than the hoax. Before we get into it, one quick thing. If you like history that gets picked apart, honestly, the papers on one side and the evidence on the other, take a second to subscribe. It is genuinely what keeps this channel going. So who actually collected the mound material, and what did he conclude? His name was Cyrus Thomas. In the 1880s, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology handed him one assignment: settle the mound builder question for good. Thomas and his teams opened mounds across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, including that copper burial at South Charleston we just walked through. In 1894, he published his findings, more than 700 pages of them. And his conclusion was the exact opposite of a cover-up. Thomas wrote that there was an unbroken chain connecting the mound builders to the historical Native American tribes. The people who built the mounds were the ancestors of the people who were still living beside them. There was no lost race. There never had been. The comfortable myth, the one that said the land's real first architects had conveniently vanished, was demolished by the Smithsonian's own report. That is the file the museums actually closed. Not the giants, the lie underneath the giants. And here is the irony: the cover-up theory cannot survive. The Smithsonian's supposed crime, in the eyes of the myth's believers, was proving that Native Americans built the mounds. The institution accused of hiding the truth is the one that established it. Now, to be fair to the other side, Thomas's own report is not silent about size. Buried in those 700 pages are a couple of mentions of skeletons believed to top 7 feet, noted plainly as unusual but real. The Giants crowd loves to quote those lines, and they are welcome to. What the lines actually show is a scientist recording an anomaly and moving on, not a conspirator scrubbing a file. Decades later, in the 1930s, the Smithsonian's own head of anthropology, a man named Alois Hrdlicka, went back through the giant reports one at a time. His verdict was blunt. The measurements came from people who wanted to believe and who did not know human anatomy. A grave measured instead of a body. Long bones laid end to end and counted as one skeleton. Fragments of ancient mastodons and elephants mistaken for men. And in more than a few cases, plain fabrication, because a giant in your county sold newspapers and drew a paying crowd. One report at a time, the giants dissolved into error, exaggeration, and outright hoax. So the museums did close the file, and they closed it correctly. But closing the file on the giants left a much larger question standing wide open, and it is the one almost nobody asks. If there was no lost race and no giants, then the mounds were built by ordinary human beings. And that should have been the beginning of the wonder, not the end of it. Because look at what ordinary human beings did here. They organized labor on the scale of a pharaoh's kingdom without a single draft animal. They moved copper hundreds of miles across a continent and beat it into art that still stops you cold in a display case. They built a city bigger than London and laid their leaders to rest on beds of shell and sheets of hammered metal. The truth was never small. It was only inconvenient. And that is what actually got buried. Not a race of giants, the achievement of the real people who built the mounds, erased twice over. First by the plow, as farm after farm flattened the earthworks into level fields, and then by a story that insisted the true builders must have been somebody else. The giant, in the end, was a way of not looking at the person. Which points to the real open question, the one the hoax never wants you to ask. Forget whether the museums hid a giant. They did not. Ask instead how much genuine history we destroyed before we ever decided it was worth studying. When two surveyors named Squire and Davis mapped the Ohio earthworks in the 1840s, they recorded hundreds of structures that no longer exist. We will never know what was inside most of them, because they were leveled for corn before anyone opened a notebook. The copper that survived is astonishing. What did not survive, we can only guess at. So the papers were half right. There really was something extraordinary in the mounds. They just seized on the one part that was invented and missed the part that was true. There was no forgotten race here. There was a forgotten civilization, and it had been standing in plain sight the whole time. The next time you pass a flat, plowed field somewhere in the Ohio or Mississippi Valley, understand that you might be looking at the site of something that took 1,000 people 100 years to raise, and one afternoon with a plow to erase. The mound builders did not vanish. Their descendants are still here. And under a law passed in 1990, the remains and the copper that were carried off to distant institutions long ago are slowly being returned to them. I want to know where you land on this. Do you think the giant reports were pure hoax, honest measuring mistakes, or a handful of genuinely tall chiefs buried under a mountain of exaggeration? Tell me in the comments, because the sharpest answers usually end up shaping the next video. And if you want more forgotten history that turned out to be stranger than the myth built on top of it, the video on screen is where to head next. As always, we'll see you in the past.